Hey,
Hey
Fabricators.
Fabricators, welcome to the place where we like to talk about all things Microsoft Fabric.
Yes, and if you're new here, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps us out and keeps you up to date when we've got any new videos.
So today we are going to talk all about workspace strategies for Microsoft Fabric. Let's dive in.
What we actually discovered is Johnny and I were talking about this in passing at one point, and we discovered we've kind of got different views on what kind of workspaces we'd set up with customers, and obviously the fated description comes up of it depends on whatever scenario we're looking at. So we want to actually run through what our ideas are, what kind of things we would probably recommend when talking to customers, and how they kind of fit together and what kind of things you need to consider as well. So should we dive right in?
Let's have a look.
Excellent. So starting with my approach, there's so many caveats with this, which we'll kind of talk about as we go through, but a kind of default approach, or the kind of thing that I'm seeing more and more often when working with customers, is a 3 workspace approach. So starting with a storage workspace, so this is where you would keep your medallion architecture. Don't get me started on naming conventions, but depending on how you want to name them, have them in its own workspace. Our second workspace would then be our engineering focused workspace. So that would have things like your notebooks, you would potentially have pipelines in there, any sort of kind of engineering artifacts that you're working with. And then your third workspace would be primarily for presentations. So that's Power BI, you've got your reports in there, you've got dashboards, you potentially have semantic models in there as well. And the main kind of reasoning of fitting these into 3 separate workspaces, the first one being security. So you've got a nice little loop around your engineering and your storage workspaces there, which is kind of focused more on your data engineer, that person or that team that's going to be working with the data, progressing it through each of those zones, and building your pipelines, building your transformations, and your cleansing rules as well. And then around that presentation workspace, you've got more of the front end users. So generally speaking, that separation of duties, where you've got data analysts, you've got report builders, you've got report users that are going to be working with the front end of the data, building that semantic model, building reports, that sort of thing on the front end. So those kind of align quite well with the security model. But also when we think about separating the engineering and the storage, that's kind of aligning to that lakehouse architecture approach of separation of storage and compute. There's a few other kind of reasons that fits together. Like if we think about using source control with these environments, the cadences with which they're going to be developed in are going to be different. So you might have someone who's developing data pipelines on like a daily basis, for example, whereas you might be making changes to the storage layer very infrequently. And same with the presentation layer. Like you might have that happening on a weekly basis. You might have that happening over a couple of weeks and then nothing for quite a while, for example. So they align kind of to the underlying Git source control and how you would be releasing code and changing it so that you're not really impacting those other environments. And the last kind of consideration that drives me down this path into this kind of architecture is your capacity planning. So it makes a nice little separation where you have a single Fabric capacity that is over your engineering and your storage capabilities. So that allows you to kind of separate the workload that's happening there, where it might be quite intensive once or twice a day, depending on if you're looking at batch loads or you're doing streaming. Whereas your presentation might be being hit constantly by users running reports or building reports and things like that. But generally speaking, the workloads on them are not going to be the same and they may not be as compatible. So it's a nice, easy way to separate them. There's a whole other video that we're definitely going to be doing on that, where we can talk about how this might look if you were federating out a platform and you might want to attribute costs to different domains and things like that. But generally, this is my starting point. I feel like that kind of hits, for me, it hits a very good kind of middle ground where it's probably, in my mind, the closest to a one-size-fits-all that we could ever really get to. It's not too many workspaces, it's not too few. What do you think? Because I know we weren't really perfectly aligned on this, but we were all
certainly. I mean, I think initially because we've got our Hey Fabricators tenant, and I was setting up some workspaces in there for a demo, and I was like, oh, hang on a minute, I don't feel like I should just set these up willy-nilly. I feel there should be some structure to it. But even my thinking on workspace planning and strategy is evolving over time. So one of the takeaways I got from Fabric February and speaking to Stan Winance, he was very, very hot on this separating storage and compute. And when I think about it, like coming from using other lakehouse type platforms and this idea of separation and storage and compute, it was like, oh, that makes so much sense. That, yeah, I think, as you say, it's the classic, it depends. I think we sort of, for me, there's a few things to take into account. There is the sort of the team structure and organization and almost the operating model. What are the roles and responsibilities of the team? I think potentially if you have got a single engineering team that is responsible for all your data ingestion and all your data transformation and surfacing that up in self-service models, there might be an argument that says that you want your semantic models inside of that engineering workspace as well.
Yeah.
If there's more separation in terms of the makeup of the team and the capabilities, so maybe you've got data engineers, but then you've got analytics engineers as well. There's an obvious sort of separation there. The capacity points are a really important one, as you say. I think that idea that you can isolate is what's really, really powerful from that perspective. I mean, I've got an example that I can run through in terms of sort of the setup that I set up quite recently with a client. This was working with a team that were relatively immature and they're also very small. There were literally 3 of them inside of a centralized data team. And I thought about this from a capability perspective in terms of the sort of personas and skill sets of the team. And then also taking into account that storage and compute separation. So it starts to look similar in some ways to like some of the things that you were doing as well. So I've got an engineering storage workspace, again with my medallion architecture there with 3 lake houses in it. I saw at one point a recommendation from Microsoft that talks about having a separate workspace per medallion layer. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so in my opinion, that seems mad, unless you're looking at like a security requirement between your bronze and silver. So like some examples that I've seen where you would ingest data and you might have some PII data that's coming into bronze. Now, putting aside that I would bring this into a separate, like a landing area to begin with and not straight into the medallion architecture. But that bronze layer having PII data that you maybe want to restrict a bit more from your silver and gold, and then maybe you're thinking about your gold is more for end users, so you might have that separation around security there. But to be honest, when you if you separate your storage into 3 separate workspaces, and then you've got all the other workspaces, if you do an engineering one again, if you do like a front end or multiple front end ones, you're already at like 5-6 workspaces, maybe more. And then what happens when you have your production environment and you've got your test and then you've got your development?
In this scenario with the client I was working with, it was a single engineering team that were responsible for all 3 layers of the ingestion and the transformation, right through to the modeling to the gold layer as well. So that made sense for me in this particular scenario. Following Stan's recommendation, I like to have my compute items in a separate workspace, like you say. From a security perspective, I might want my analytics guys to be able to access that storage workspace so that they can browse data. But I definitely don't want them poking around my pipelines and my notebooks and messing about the code in those. So that's a nice little separation there. And then, as you say, from an isolation perspective, in terms of workloads, if you can have these on separate capacities as well, then you're not going to have your pipelines potentially blowing up and then taking down all of your storage and things like that as well. Mirroring that, I've got a workspace for analytics storage. This is where my semantic models are. This is probably harks back to a kind of historic approach coming from a Power BI background, where I was always sort of thought the idea of keeping your semantic models and your reports in separate workspaces was always good practice. I think that's kind of historically based around the fact that you could only used to be able to have one app per workspace, and you might want to reuse the same semantic model.
Okay, yeah.
And then with that, the idea of an analytics reporting workspace as well. Now, in practice, what that actually looks like is they become sort of topic-based workspaces. So it doesn't become a single reporting workspace for analytics. It might be one that's sort of more domain-based for a sales audience, finance for a finance audience, and supply chain for a supply chain audience, for argument's sake. That kind of storage and compute separation as well isn't perfect in this scenario for the analytics side of that equation. In analytics world with a semantic model, the data's being stored in the semantic model. Potentially, there's definitely some compute involved there as well to an extent if you've got any kind of transformation going on in those semantic layers, and certainly you've got processing happening in those semantic models as well. So that's kind of what I went with for this particular client. I got interested with the capacities as well. So this idea where we talked about capacity planning, I could actually have my engineering storage and engineering compute in separate capacities. It's isolating the workloads, but also you can get into patterns like maybe you want that storage available around the clock so people can access that data to do ad hoc analysis. But from a compute perspective, from my pipelines, actually, if I'm only doing batch loading, if I'm only doing once a night, overnight batch, then potentially I can have my storage capacity on a reserved instance that's available around the clock, but maybe my compute I can do on a pay-as-you-go and spin it up just for a couple of hours overnight, spin it back down again to try and isolate the costs, but potentially reduce the costs as well.
I like that idea. And it's like one of the things though is like I feel like the granularity that you need to get into to like work out what level your kind of engineering storage capacity would need to be, that you were still getting the performance and it wasn't bottlenecking something else, but it was costing as little as possible without being restrictive, if you know what I mean. I guess that's where, like, as you start to kind of use different capacities against different workspaces, how do you stop creating either a bottleneck on one of them as part of that kind of like full data platform process, but also how do you stop one of them just being way too big and you're just spending money for the sake of spending money, if you know what I mean. So
from an analytics perspective, there are relatively small data volumes and they didn't really justify going sort of full F64 capacity. And all of their end users, because they were already using Power BI, they all had Power BI Pro licenses. So it was like, well, actually, I can, rather than even using Fabric capacities, we used Power BI Pro workspaces for our semantic models. Just on import mode. And then we could have as many Pro workspaces as we wanted for the those topic-based ones. So I guess just the other consideration with this as well, and we have alluded to it already too, I guess if we were trying to answer the question, how many workspaces do you need? What's the right answer? What have I got there? 6 there for this relatively small implementation.
Yeah.
That's before I've even gotten into the realms of thinking about duplicating that across development and prod. So again, for this particular client, they're a relatively small organization. Previously, they hadn't had that development lifecycle. They just basically yeeted everything into prod environments. And to go through sort of full dev test prod just seemed a little bit overkill for them. They were happy sort of working with a dev environment and doing all of their testing in dev, and then promoting to prod when they were happy for it. So even in that scenario, I've gone from 6 workspaces to 12 workspaces for a relatively small implementation. So the workspace sprawl can be a problem. I think, again, you were alluding to it, I think, in terms of, a workspace per lake house seems like overkill, and once you start multiplying that up, it gets bigger and bigger. But ultimately, it depends on what your requirements are going to be. I don't think you should consolidate workspaces for the sake of it to try and save your work.
We can't leave people with an "it depends" though, right? So like, without us sitting down, because obviously it's one of these situations where you could sit here and map out like 15 different variations, and you'll always get someone that's like, not quite there, and we're not quite there, and we kind of fit in here. I guess like a good takeaway for the video then is like, what's the kind of things people should focus on, like when you're making these decisions? Like in my mind, let's go through like a numbered list. In my mind, top of the list is KISS. Keep it simple. Stupid.
Yeah.
Keep it as simple as possible. Like, don't start just adding workspaces or adding environments. Like I've worked with customers that have mimicked 4 different environments because their source applications have 4 different environments. And it's like, well, if the source application is developing in their development environment, would you ever really want to connect to that? Would you not connect the development Fabric environment to their test, for example? So it's just like, don't just build it out because the capability's there, basically. What would be your number 1 or your number 2 there?
I mean, I feel like I want to coin a phrase now, like, and I'm paraphrasing Matthew Roach at this point, but from a workspace planning perspective, as few workspaces as possible, but as many as necessary.
That's a fancy way of saying it depends.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I think the takeaway for me is there's not one right answer. There's not a one size fits all. But there are specifics to take into account. So the specifics to take into account for me, team, like organizational structure and team structure. So again, we haven't run through an example of it, but I think both versions we looked at there were kind of centralized teams, but I've worked with organizations where they are more federated. So perhaps you've got an engineering team that works in one part of the business, an engineering team that works in the second part of the business. You probably want them to work on separate code bases and have their own separate workspaces for their work, which, ultimately downstream from that, you can potentially consolidate in a layer. But yeah, you might want to keep those separate. That might even just be a split, as you sort of said before, in terms of sensitive and non-sensitive data, or it might be reporting lines. It might be that each division has their own engineering teams available to them. So that sort of organizational and operating model type element of it is a one thing for it. I think the skills and capabilities and responsibilities of those teams is the next one for me. As I say, in terms of, like, I've had scenarios where I've kind of had my warehouse and my semantic model in one workspace because analytics engineers looked after the transformation from silver into gold. So they have their warehouse and their semantic models in one workspace because that's what their responsibility was. But engineering had a separate workspace for bronze and silver data because they were more about ingestion and cleansing. But again, you could have a third. You could have engineering, you could have analytics engineering, but then you could have more like semantic modeling and report building and things like that. And then maybe an analyst team as well. So it very much depends on that team structure.
Yeah, I think there's definitely, like, it's kind of hard to go wrong. I think, or I believe it's quite hard to go wrong. But as long as you're keeping specific things in mind, so like keep it as simple as possible because you're going to have to maintain all of these workspaces you're creating, and then you've got the multiplication depending on how many environments you've got.
I think my counter to that, my only point to that is, like, sometimes workspace sprawl is unavoidable. If you get to that point, look at strategies for coping with that. Look at automation. Look at using a Git repository to control your workspace configuration, so that basically you can configure something and it will spin up. It might spin up 5 or 6 workspaces on one small config because it knows it needs several different environments. So I think, again, that kind of, I guess, flies in the face of that keep it simple. That's adding a little bit more complexity. But sometimes the complexity is required.
Probably most importantly for me is the security aspect of it. So if you have one team that does all the things, then you don't really need to separate them out all that much. You can, and it makes sense too, and it's good for kind of long-term growth and scaling. But if you have 2 separate teams that work separately and require separate permission sets and things like that, then that's a nice, easy evidence that you should be splitting your workspaces and you should try and align them with those teams. And your example there, where you had one team that would be working on the data warehouse and the semantic model and the reports and stuff like that. So yeah, move that over there. Doesn't matter that it sort of breaks up your nice, pretty medallion architecture and moves things about. It aligns with your team, so it aligns with your business.
I think from a security perspective, just one other thing I'll call out is that obviously workspaces and workspace security is a large part of managing that. You do need to be aware of the fact that the workspace permissions model is quite permissive. If you give just the lowest level of workspace access, still gives people quite a lot of stuff. It's worth bearing in mind from a one security perspective. You can start, rather than managing that security at a workspace level, you can start managing it more granular. I can't say, you know the word I'm looking for, at a lower level, and sort of give access on specific artifacts within a workspace and things like that as well. So I think that is just something to bear in mind. One, I guess, final call out from me, if that's cool, is that there is guidance out there. So from a Power BI and Fabric perspective, there are articles out there on various websites that can help you focus with this. I think one of the things that I really liked in this was this idea of making sure that you're planning with intent. So making sure I think this line here, understand something's purpose and plan accordingly.
I think people underestimate when going into a Fabric implementation. It's one of those things where you don't necessarily need to have everything like perfectly mapped out to begin with, but having a good idea and a good idea where you're going to go will mean you're not having to rework things and move things about after the fact.
Yeah,
but it's certainly not something that's kind of locking you into stuff, is it?
Yeah, so no, I agree. What I'd really like to know is, what are other people doing? What do people think of those sort of patterns that we've described there? Does that sort of resonate? Are they sort of similar patterns that people out and about are already using? Are there any other considerations you can think of that maybe we've missed out here that we should be bearing in mind? I'd be really, really keen. Obviously, hit up the comments below if you've got any thoughts on it.
Yes, and if you want to talk about some fictitious organization that has some horrific setup, I would love to hear those ones as well.
Workspace horror stories. Look,
yes, there we go. Maybe that's
Halloween special. Cool, good stuff. Well, that's been a good chat. I say it's feels like it was quite nice to have quite a conversational video, I guess. And it is one of these things that's open to interpretation. But it's just making sure that people are thinking about the right things when doing this kind of stuff.
Yeah, definitely. It has been good. And until the next video, goodbye.
Catch you soon.